Welcome to the Building Your Career podcast. I'm your host, Don Tarjanskis, and join us as we explore the world of construction. Each episode, we welcome a guest that shares career highlights and career advice, and hopefully inspires the next generation of construction professionals.
Welcome to another edition of the Building Your Career podcast. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Stephen Beggs from Curtins, who is going to talk through all things to do with heritage and sustainability as the specialist topic. But I'm very excited to have Stephen on. I think it's a topic that a lot of people have been asking to hear some more about. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a one-stop deep dive into those two topics. So Stephen, I will give the floor to you. I just wanted to start off the conversation just by asking, where does your experience come from with the heritage and conservation sector?
Okay, well, thank you, Dom. It's quite a long story, actually. I've been working about 30 years now. So a long time ago, I started as a graduate engineer, and nobody had heard of carbon and heritage type projects then. It seemed to be new build. Everything's new build. And I started building designing, should say, the bridges associated with the approach roads to the second Severn crossing, following my civil engineering degree. And what a fantastic start for a young engineer. It was really exciting. Please design a bridge. It wasn't the big one across the water. It was all the little ones that were over the motorway on the way as you approached it. So 5 or 6 grads started all on the same day. We each got a bridge to design, and we did that for 6 months, 9 months, and then we got to go to site to see it built. It was so exciting. It really fired up a love of big engineering, big projects. And there was no recognition of carbon or carbon reduction or environmental impact or anything like that at the time. I'd been right through university without ever discussing the effect on the environment of our work. It was just, we're directing the great sources of nature towards big engineering. That's how I felt I was at the start of my career. And then after that was done, I started doing some work on bridge assessments where I was looking at viaducts, railway viaducts, huge things that were 100 years old. I thought, wait a minute, these are really good. They've been here for a long time now, and they're still looking good, and they're still working, and they're still carrying trains. And I learned an awful lot about how carefully previous engineers had designed things and how well they were lasting if they'd been well detailed. So that just stuck in my head as a good thing to do. And then various other things happened. I went to Hong Kong for a bit, did a little bit of work out there. That was all new build. Build it as fast as you can. We've just got to expand. We're growing. We're building tomorrow. Please design it. Please build it. That was very fast pace. And then when I came back to England after that, I got my first real sort of heritage project, which was to go to Clevedon Pier down in North Somerset and help my boss be the engineering team on restoring the pier head at the end of the pier. So I figured this was a bit like a one-ended bridge. I'd got some experience of bridges, so I thought, well, this is just a one-ended bridge. It just ends in the sea. So that's all right. That's within my skill set. And that was cast iron and wrought iron and really old concrete. And again, a bit like with the railway viaducts, it showed me the value of working with what other clever engineers had done in the past. So I did that for 2 or 3 years. And then again, company change. I went to work for a company called Whitby Bird, which is now part of Ramboll. And they did very careful engineering of beautiful buildings, nicely detailed, working with thoughtful architects. And that showed me another side of my career, which was sort of worrying about the details to make things look good and to make things function well so that people enjoyed being in those sorts of buildings. And that was really instructive. And one project that really stuck with me was the RSPCA headquarters, where we used exposed concrete slabs, and the windows of the building used to open automatically at night time so that the hot air that gathered in the building through the day could be purged through the building at night. And the concrete slabs used to absorb some of the heat off the computers and the people. So the space was very well thought of by all people, the M&E engineers, the structural engineers, the architects. And it was a sort of whole design, a really holistic design. And that, I think, is probably where I started thinking about the fact that the structural engineers and the M&E and the architects could work very closely together to create really special buildings. And I went from Whitby Bird to Building Design Partnership, where I stayed for 10 days. And that is a truly collaborative practice with engineers, M&E, and structures all in the room at the same time. And that was great. And 10 years, really good projects there, including some heritage projects, including some carbon sensitive projects, because people were starting to talk about it now. And I gained a lot of experience in the very broadest way of looking at my input to the process, which was to put an awful lot of concrete and steel into buildings. And I started to think about quantifying the impact of that. This was in the mid 2005, 2008. But people weren't really interested in talking about the quantity of embodied carbon. They were really talking about how to minimize the operational carbon in buildings, how to stop it leaking heat, how to make the lights more efficient, how to make the heating more efficient. And how much carbon was in the concrete wasn't really a thing. So I had several conversations where everybody was sort of reacting to my comments with, yeah, but we're not really interested in that. We're just talking about the heating. So thanks, but not now. And so after so many of those conversations, you sort of give up after a bit. You think maybe I'm just on the wrong track here. I left BDP after 10 years and I came to Curtins. And we started a similar sort of rich mix of new builds and an increasing number of heritage existing building projects. And I realized that this business of measuring carbon was starting to become more important. And it all sort of came to a head when we as a company were trying to decide what to do with carbon in the face of the climate change and in the face of architects declare climate emergency and engineers declare climate emergency. Well, what's Curtins' response going to be? So I agreed that I would try and form a strategy for carbon reduction in Curtins. And it was fairly simple. It was that we don't know what we're talking about. We'd better understand collectively what we're talking about. So we started an awareness campaign from everybody, from the chief exec to the accounts clerk to the engineers in between. And we wanted everybody at all levels of our business to have a basic appreciation of the impact that our business had on the environment from the amount of concrete and steel that we used. So we got a plan together, awareness, talking to our clients about it, being brave with some of the decisions we made, and in particular, measuring it. So we set up some fairly simple tools to measure carbon so that we could start to say, as well as that being a £1 million building, it's a 1,000 tons of carbon building. And from that, we started a database, which now sits at just over 300 projects. And we can start to see that a steel frame of 3 stories might have this much carbon in it, a concrete building of 4 stories with a basement will have this carbon with it. So we can start making informed decisions with our clients on which sort of building they might want to consider if they are bothered about carbon or not bothered about carbon. And it's really built a head of steam. And just this week, I listened into the first net zero carbon legislation seminar, where there's the new standard that's come out. And it's a guidance document, not fully legislation yet, but it's a guidance document. And this is casting into future law the fact that we must measure carbon in our buildings and that certain limits will be acceptable and others won't. So there we go. That's it, really.
I love that. I love that story all the way through. I suppose there's 2 points that I wanted to pick out on there, because obviously you've been there from the beginning when it wasn't really talked about and you had an interest in it. You've seen that kind of shift and then you've seen that shift to the emergency from architects and engineers, which I do remember as well. And I think it's a case of what happened in terms of the collective mindset to be able to shift to get to the point where there was a switch in trying to take sustainability a little bit more seriously.
It's a really good question. And slightly strangely, I think I have a definite answer. It was 2019 for me, I've been watching this for a long time. I saw very incremental progress. No one was doing anything big. And in 2019, Greta Thunberg started shouting about climate change. David Attenborough did the Blue Planet. and supermarkets put a tax on plastic bags.
Yeah.
Three completely separate, or
Yeah.
are they really separate, events and movements that brought carbon and the impact of our activities to the public domain, big style. It wasn't just geeky stuff anymore. It was out there on the street, and it made a big impact. And I found that we were able to talk to our clients much more around that time and beyond than before. The other thing I'd like to say is this, we're going to talk quite a bit about heritage in a minute. And of course, the best way of reducing carbon is to work with what we've got.
Yeah.
That's from a carbon point of view, but also under many other metrics as well, like people like their heritage. They're nostalgic about their heritage. They feel a fondness and a connection to their heritage. So on many metrics, keeping your heritage and working with it is good, and it fits in very well in the context of a climate emergency.
Awesome. Just on the second point, I was quite interested in. I was quite interested in the legislation that you said that had come out recently. Obviously, you don't need to go into loads and loads of detail about it, but could you kind of highlight the key points or what people who are interested in sustainability need to be aware of when it comes to changes in the law or the policies?
Yeah, okay, so this could be quite easy because I don't know enough about it yet. So when I talked about the last 5 years at Curtins, where we've been developing our own plan for carbon, that has been in the absence of legislation. There is no legislation to cover embodied carbon, which is the carbon of stuff. There's operational carbon is covered in buildings by things like Part L of the building regs. And that talks about things like you can only have so many kilowatt hours in your building. I'm really on the edge of my knowledge here, Dom. So that's on the operational side. In the embodied side, people were doing their best in the absence of legislation. And I am only one seminar into the net zero carbon building standard. And I would urge people who might be interested in it to get a copy, have a read of it, see what it means, because it is the precursor to legislation, which may come through the form of Part Z, building regs, but this is all information at the moment. As I say, I'm at the edge of my knowledge there. I know that the core of it is about us measuring and reducing, setting targets for the reduction of embodied carbon and meeting particular limits that are set for different classes of building in different sectors. So a hospital will have a different embodied carbon allowance than a private house per square meter because it's a more intensive building. So please don't requote me on the exacts of that, but I think your listeners and viewers who are interested should go and dig themselves out an early version. It's called the pilot version of the net zero carbon building standard.
Okay, brilliant. If I can, I'll try and have a link to that below in the show notes. So anyone who clicks on the link below will be able to get that pilot version. I know towards the end of that, you were talking about the reuse of existing buildings as well. So for people who are passionate about the reuse of existing, what are the kind of the key things to look out for when it comes to linking the reuse of existing to kind of the sustainability side of things as well?
Well, I think reuse as an absolute is not something that you should do on every building. If you've got a building that's falling down, that's rotten, that's corroding, that's deformed, that's settling, then you would need an immense amount of resource, both financial and carbon, to get that building back to how it should be. So in order to take the decision whether you do that, you have to consider whether it's a building of value or not a building of value for any number of metrics. So I'll just pull an example out of the air. Windsor Castle, it burnt down. So much of the internals were lost. The cost to restore Windsor Castle, when was this? 15 years ago? I'm guessing the age there. The resources to refurbish and renew that castle were immense, the scale. But the value of that building to the country, to the royal family, to our collective history was also immense. So you could say there's the justification. If you've got a 2-story parade of shops in the centre of a city which are run down low-rise buildings on a prime piece of development land with not much embodied carbon buried in it, that's a completely different scenario. It might be better to put accommodation much needed for local residents in a 6-story block back on that site. So it's about the values that you hold against Windsor Castle and your local shopping parade.
Touching on that as well, I know, you were kind of talking about key metrics when it comes to sustainability. So what are the kind of the most common metrics that people should be looking out for when it does come to the entire design process in terms of having it as sustainable as possible?
Ooh, that's a big question. The key metrics: cost in carbon, cost in money. How do those balance? Program of delivery. Can you deliver it from where you need it? Is it sustainable from the environmental point of view? Are we creating more environmental harm? For example, by putting a new road through a field or something like that. That might be justified on cost and in convenience to the users, but what's the harm to the landscape and the biodiversity? So it's a whole bunch of things, really.
I was quite keen for you to expand. I know you touched on it before about the Curtins Carbon Initiative and you being kind of involved in that. Could you just kind of expand on that and how you first got into that and how you've seen that develop and grow as well?
Yeah, certainly. The way I got into the Curtins Initiative was that the chief exec was looking for somebody to lead and develop a strategy. And he knew that I had sort of been messing around with carbon in the five or 6 years that I'd been in the business. And we just decided it was a partnership that we should sort of put together and make it work and deliver a formal plan. So I wrote the strategy round about the Christmas of 2019 going into 2020, so just before COVID. And the Australian bushfires were on the telly at the time. And they made a really big impact on me, and sure on everybody else as well. And so when we were talking, I prepared a presentation which I gave to our management team sort of nationally, saying this is what I think we should do. I only put up one slide of why we should do it, and it was that's why we should do it. We could have put up 1,000 slides of what climate change looks like, but that was topical at the time. And it was on the back of that we formed this 7-point strategy, really, of awareness, talking to our clients, measuring, quantifying, being brave, recording what we were doing, so that we were building a library of awareness and knowledge and data, which could become a tool for us going forwards. Then COVID hit. So all of that was disseminated remotely through the company, through, Teams seminars, basically, because we couldn't travel. And we tried to build a head of steam within the company that people were obliged to measure embodied carbon on their projects. And we set one of our quality assurance KPIs, as well as, for example, doing risk assessments, doing proper project briefings, doing proper fee proposals. We set a new one, which was measuring carbon on your project. So it was in there right at the core of our business. And Curtins is multidisciplinary. We do structures, civils, geotechnical, environmental, transport planning, etc. And it was very much focused towards structures. And the reason for that was that structures are the big bad guys. We're the ones using most concrete, most steel, and we have the biggest environmental impact. So we focused very much first on structures, because if we could sort that out, we could set a pattern for our colleagues in other disciplines to work alongside us to develop measuring tools for themselves, other strategies that might be more appropriate to their disciplines than ours. But we led with structures because it had the biggest impact. And I wanted to just add that when our sustainability campaign within Curtins built up sufficient momentum, we realized that we needed somebody to take this task on, to live and breathe it every day. I was trying to run an office and do this, and it wasn't enough. So we advertised internally for a member of staff who could become our sustainability coordinator, sustainability manager. And we recruited from within, And one of our engineers from Leeds office took on the role, and she has taken this forward into Curtins with guidance notes, doing many presentations around the country, being involved with the iStructE and the ICE in pushing forward the Curtins agenda. So from sort of one person starting with a presentation of this would be a good thing to do, it's built sufficient momentum, and Neve, my colleague, she has built and driven the creation of the database, our various tools. And so I think we now look like a professional organization which has sustainability at its heart, not as a sort of bolt-on, if you like.
And I like the way that is very much project and data focused first.
Yeah.
So, using projects as examples to then look at and analyze the data for improvement.
Yeah.
Because, I think particularly when I was at uni studying architecture and talking about sustainability, it wasn't really, it was just, here's a load of stuff you can do.
Yeah.
Slap it on at the end, job done really. But I like that much more measured approach where it is data focused.
Well, it has to be. And I was really brought up sharply by a situation we had on a project in Wales a few years ago. The Welsh government are very far progressed with their green agenda compared to the English government. And the Future Generations Act puts really onerous obligations on design teams in Wales, and it's good. It's a model for progress. And the government wanted to produce a particular hospital in timber. And to cut a very long story short, because of fire considerations, which weren't fully resolved in the industry at the time, we were obliged to consider putting plasterboard around timber from a fire point of view. And what we realized, I'm condensing a huge saga here down to very short, but what we realized was that by the time you had done timber beams with timber slabs, with a concrete screed to dampen the noise and damp the vibration, and plasterboard around it, etc., 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 you do the quantitative carbon assessment, and you get more carbon than if you'd done a modest concrete flat slab. And so, going back to your comment about the difference between qualitative and quantitative, quantitative is absolutely the way to go based on the data, because it would have been quite easy, and I think I'd probably have done it myself, to say a timber hospital's the way to go. Wow, if we can do it in timber, brilliant, this is great. But actually, the answer was to reduce the spans of our columns down to get modestly spanning structural floor slabs, which we had to do to make the timber work anyway, and then make that flip to think, well, now that we've got really nice short spans, that would be a really efficient concrete slab as well. So we did that. It was the right solution, was to go concrete. Leave the timber in the roof, and in the large span single story spaces where it's beautiful, doesn't have to be fire protected. That's great. But in the working areas, the wards, where you can tolerate small spans, use concrete.
That's a brilliant case study. Super, super interesting that. It's, almost as if from an initial perspective, it would make much more sense to use the sustainable material, but on analysis, that wasn't the most effective way to go.
And I think what has come from that, and this is the thing that I'm really, really pleased with, that has arisen in the last few years, being brave and taking a position on carbon and raising carbon in a design team meeting as a fundamental that we must consider, has started a range of conversations with our clients that I never believed we'd have. Because sometimes you can go, well, you could keep the building you've got and then your carbon impact will be much less. Oh yeah, but that's difficult because of. And we go right through the loop. And sometimes it is difficult and we're not going to do it. But other times it's, do you know what? That might just work. Yeah, we could do that. Why don't we strip all the cladding off the building, which is shot to bits? Why don't we keep the frame, assess it, be really, do our due diligence to make sure that frame, which has been protected from the weather for the last 50, 60 years, whatever, is good for another 50, 60 years. Let's keep it. It puts more onus on us as structural engineers to be very careful with our engineering, to assess the building very carefully, inspect it, strengthen it locally, repair any damage. So there's a lot of thinking and creativity on our part. But it's in a very different way from let's build a brand new building on this greenfield site just outside the edge of the town.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot more thought process.
We don't get many of those. We don't get many of those now. The emphasis has changed. Probably, I said that 2019 was the real change in when people would at least talk about embodied carbon. I would say the sort of feeling of an unstoppable momentum towards keeping buildings is more like a year, 18 months that we've been running now.
That's very, very interesting. So for some of our listeners who are, passionate about the sustainability side of things, want to get involved in any talks or events, I know you're quite passionate about, kind of events and speaking at events and things like that. So for anyone based in and around the Bristol area, is there any kind of talks that you've done where you think that's a good event, or any community groups that people can kind of get involved in, or what kind of groups are out there for people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do like doing presentations. I must say that I think my presentations that I have given probably fall into two groups. Special interest evening type presentations, a local round table or Rotary Club or industrial society who want to talk about something. Let's say, for example, Clevedon Pier. I've presented on that several times. Or perhaps industry standard conventions, conferences, seminars, where I'm one of a number of technical speakers addressing a technical audience on a technical matter. So basically, you're talking to your peers.
Yeah.
The group that's missing is where I talk to sort of informal community group. That is less common. I have spoken at University West of England as a sort of visiting lecturer just once on embodied carbon, all the stuff we're talking about now. And that was to a room full of students who were partway through their studies. And I like to think that that brought a little bit of, if you like, day-to-day consultancy advice and experience and examples into an academic core area which they'd have been learning about. Hopefully, the academic plus the practical allowed them to see perhaps the relevance of what was being taught in the marketplace, in the outside world. But in terms of just saying, oh, we're going to hire the local town hall, village hall, community room to do a talk on carbon, that's not something I've been involved with. No reason why we shouldn't, but it would be finding an audience who was prepared to listen on a subject like this. I think it comes out best through project examples, to be honest. It can be quite a dry subject as an academic thing, but if you tie it into this is what we did at Clevedon Pier, or this is what we did to keep the old town hall in this town that everybody knows and loves, or to restore a museum that was derelict, that becomes a much more lively and vibrant debate.
And that leads us on really, really nicely. I'm just going to share the screen with everyone here, but that leads us on really, really nicely to a couple of examples that we have at the end here. So, Stephen, could you talk us through these two absolutely incredible looking projects and talk us through your kind of involvement?
Yes, certainly. So I'll talk about the one at the bottom first, Clevedon Pier. I've mentioned that a bit already. I was a young engineer working on this in 1995 and 6, and I used it as my project to put forward from my civils to get myself chartered when I'd done the work. So this was a really key project in my career. It was also a key project for Clevedon Pier because the buildings that you can see on the pier head down at the end there, they weren't there. They'd been taken down after the pier had partially collapsed in 1970 and stored in a farmyard. And my job, working with some very skilled colleagues, was to go to the farmyard, get all the bits and put them back on the end of the pier. So we did that. And that was my first association with the pier. And I was involved with it on and off for about 3 years through those works, seeing it built with divers and boats and cranes and all sorts of things that you need to build over water. It was difficult work. And the pier was finished, and I split my association with the pier for about the next 10 years, probably, before being asked to become part of the board, the trust board that looked after the pier, if you like, the client. And so I've been doing that for the last 16 or 17 years, and I sit as a sort of engineering advisor on the board of the Pier Trust. We've had numerous works since, including the Visitors Centre, which is at the landward end, just off to the right of that picture. And I see my duty, no, I'm going to go back and say the other people on the board are just as important, but fulfill different roles. There's a chairman, a treasurer, there's an operations manager who runs the pier day to day, there's someone who looks after marketing, education, and there's engineering as well. So we have a fully rounded board of directors who look after the safeguarding of that pier. It's 155 years old. How do we make it stand for another 155 years? Is that even possible? All of those things. How do we keep visitors coming onto it, etc., etc. So rather than the pure engineering now, I'm looking after the pier in its broadest dimension with my colleagues. So that's the pier. I'll go through the particular points on the left in a minute. Safe to say that in my day job, we also have a job to be the conservation engineers on Newport Transporter Bridge. This is an enormous structure in South Wales, in Newport. It has a gondola, which is a sort of platform just above the river level. You can't see it on the picture there. And it's like a sort of aerial cable car. So you get on it and it hangs from cables from the big boom across the top, and it carries you at a constant height across the river to the other side, you and your cars. So there's a lot of restoration work being done on that at the moment. And I thought it was helpful to just run through the bullet points on the left and look at some of the similarities between these two structures. The first point is a big one. Why are we doing this? Why bother spend money on these things? And the justification I give to it is that we're conserving things that are special, and there's only any point in doing it if they remain or become vibrant pieces of heritage for long-term enjoyment. They can't be rebuilt to be a museum piece. Otherwise, what are you doing? The society's got lots of needs for funding. It shouldn't be to make museum pieces. So, for example, at the pier, we try really hard to have music events, Remembrance Day parades, carol services. The ship, the Waverley, comes down from Glasgow in June and spends 4 weeks taking passengers on and off the pier. We're looking at tidal power generation. Can we put a small tidal power turbine within the tidal zone on the pier head? We want it to be vibrant and lively and part of a relevant heritage environment in the town so that people see its value. Newport Bridge is still under the restoration contract, so all of those things about keeping it running, keeping it vibrant are to come, and the council are planning that at the moment. So that's the first point. You've got to keep them current, got to keep them vibrant, otherwise there's no point in doing it. Second point, I think is probably self-evident. Working on these is really expensive because these two are over water, but if you had a medieval castle, it's not going to be cheap to keep that standing up. So you need to be creative, you need to have fundraising. That's the last point. The constant need to raise funds for maintenance. And it's a continual pressure on governing trusts and director boards of heritage assets as to how they keep the funding coming to maintain their beautiful structures. Third point, weather and tides. Imagine trying to work on that in winter. Doesn't work. Tides, the legs on the Clevedon Pier that you can see there, just above the boys' heads there, that's when the tide is nearly at its highest. When it's at its lowest, there's about 8 or 9 meters more of legs visible. So if you want to paint the bottom bits, you have to be pretty sharp with your paintbrush and work around the tides and plan your works accordingly. Harsh working conditions we've talked about with the weather. Visitor experience, this is an interesting one. we sometimes get asked, why should people bother coming to Clevedon? Because there's nothing at the end of it. Why would I want to walk down that? And there's the point. Because there's nothing at the end of it. Just go and stand on the end and watch the world go by. Yet in the middle of a storm in winter, it's a completely different place. You can still walk to the end, and it's a different experience. And we have people who come to the pier all through the seasons to see it in its different moods. From a purely engineering point of view, the materials, the engineering, the extraordinary engineering of these structures is notable academically, practically. The awe of what these engineers did with limited tools, limited machinery, etc., is extraordinary. There are only 5 transporter bridges in the whole world that were built. And this, I think I'm right in saying, maybe someone will correct me, is the largest of them. When it's restored, it will probably be the most, along with the one in Bilbao, one of the ones that's working best as well. So there's only a few of these things. It's Grade 1 listed. Clevedon Pier's Grade 1 listed, the only working Grade 1 listed pier in the country. So these are special things. And as a society, we can take a view on whether we should keep them, whether they're worth keeping, whether it's worth the lottery giving money to this through a grant. I think it is. But there's an interesting debate with society as to whether it is. I've said the Grade 1 listed. The visitor centres, both of them, have got new visitor centres to try and bring people in, to try to give opportunities for people, this is going to sound brutal, to spend their money, a cup of coffee, nice piece of cake, lunch, fish and chips on a Friday evening at the pier. We have to be able to let people enjoy it, let people get something from it, and use their funding and their donations responsibly so that we can keep the structures standing. And then the sailings and the gondola we've touched on. Newport Bridge has a gondola, an element of excitement, something to show the kids, etc., etc. Let's go across up the river on this crazy platform. And then, of course, at the pier, we've got boats that come, and just to be walking over the sea. That's why the piers were built in Victorian times. It was so you could walk safely over the sea. It was seen as a very dramatic thing to do. So there you go. I guess what I'm saying is, I think these are valuable. I think they have a place for us as we go forwards, as a society that needs to look forwards on where we're going, as well as backwards and where we've come from and what we value in that continuum between those two bits. There you go.
And I share your sentiments completely on those two. They're wonderful structures. I was really, really excited about you talking to me about that. And I need to go visit them now. I have to.
You do.
On my
Get
list
down
of
to the
places to visit.
pier, Dom. Well worth
definitely.
it. Windy day or a sunny day, both.
That was awesome. Well, Stephen, genuinely, I've been just blown away by this conversation. I think it's been incredible. I know our listeners will be really happy with the insights that you've managed to provide as well on this one. So that just goes to say thank you so much for being a guest on the Building Your Career podcast.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Dom.
Joining us on the Building Your Career podcast. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our guest and learning about the different career paths available. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe so we can reach even more listeners. And if anyone wants any free CV advice or simply wants to know the options available to them, don't hesitate to get in touch.